started, if you haven't gotten some tea, we have tea there and some fruit and things. And we also have information up here and some T-shirts that you can even buy at the end. So welcome to this evening on what is the Holtec proposal. And we're doing this with Interfaith, New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. And we thought it would be important to share with people what this project is and why it's important for us to know about it, but to put it in the context of an ethical, moral perspective first. So our evening is going to go like this. We're going to have a short reflection to begin, and then myself and Reverend Jeremiah Griffin will offer just 15 minutes of ethical, moral implications and background, and then Don Hancock from Southwest Research Information Center will offer about 15 or 20 minutes of the very specific information of this, and then we will open it up to questions. Okay? So again, thank you all for coming. So we're going to begin with just a reflection tonight that takes quotes from a variety of people from various traditions and philosophies. And it's on the moral imperative to care for the planet. Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was loaned to you by your children. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. An Indian proverb.
All creation is the Lord's, and we are responsible for the ways in which we use and abuse it. From United Methodist Social Principles.
When all the trees have been cut down, when all the animals have been hunted, when all the waters are polluted, when all the air is unsafe to breathe, only then will you discover you cannot eat money. Pre-prophecy.
The day is not far distant when humanity will realize that biologically it is faced with a choice between suicide and adoration. Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
The environment is not just another issue, but an inescapable challenge to what it means to be religious. The Very Reverend James P. Morton, Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine.
The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. Mahatma Gandhi.
When it comes to loving our neighbor, we should remember we all live upwind and upstream from someone else, both in time and place. Source unknown.
In our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. From the great law of the Iroquois Confederacy.
The plain fact is that the planet does not need more successful people, but it does desperately need more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of every shape and form. It needs people who live well in their places. It needs people of moral courage, willing to join the fight to make the world habitable and humane. And these needs have little to do with success as our culture has defined it. David Orr.
So with all of those wisdom words, we just ask blessings on this evening and blessings to everyone who might be viewing this on live stream or seeing it on the video in the next few days or this week. So this gathering is to learn about the Holtec high-level nuclear waste transportation storage facility. It's a mouthful, that is proposed to be in southeast New Mexico between Hobbs and Carlsbad. And so our evening, we are going to begin this with talking a little bit about a context of our concerns from an ethical, moral perspective, and then moving into the facts of this concern. So I'd like to turn this over to Reverend Jeremiah Griffin, who is going to begin. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello. There you are. Glad you came here to learn. I'm here to learn also. I don't know if we could back that up. I'm used to doing this. I'll talk loudly. Okay. So yeah, my name's Father Jeremiah Griffin. I'm the rector at St. Chad's Episcopal Church here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So we're up in the northeast Heights corner of town. It's an honor to get to be here with you as we learn together about the Holtec, the proposed Holtec site, and then consider what our response to that plan should be. I'm here as a board member for New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light, but also because Sister Joan invited me. Thank you for that. And I'll be presenting a few short reflections on the underpinning moral and theological or scriptural matters at play when considering something like Holtec. And obviously, hence the caller, I'm coming at this from a Christian perspective. It's kind of hard to hide. But I recognize that this room is not probably homogeneous or ubiquitous, probably people of all types of different backgrounds and faiths or philosophies in here. And obviously, we respect that. Our board is made up of people from various different faiths. So I want to invite you to hear what I say. Obviously going to be an authentic Christian perspective coming from myself, but hear it through whatever filter or lens you need to have for yourself for this to have some why we decided to show up tonight. What are the concerns that we have that motivated us to be here? And then after reflecting on those things, we can dive into the specifics. So without further ado, I've decided to narrow this talk, obviously could go on for a long time, down to two focal points. The first question I'm going to be asking and attempting to answer, no small feat, what is God's will when it pertains to discerning something like Holtec or just creation care in general, as if we could ever fully know God's mind. And if you're not comfortable using that kind of religious language, please insert whatever higher purpose or philosophy makes sense to you. And then from that foundational standpoint, that first point, we'll ask the second question, what response then is required of us? Based upon, of course, how we answer the first question. As a Christian, I look first to the sacred writings of my faith that are found in Scripture, and I do this intentionally tonight, specifically because these are also what's held in common by all the various strains of the Christian faith. Tradition and doctrine aside, we all have the Bible, so look in there and let's see what we can discern about what God's will for this world is when it comes to the health of our planet and the creatures, including ourselves, that call it home. By the way, this is a question that I think Christians have done poorly addressing over generations now, but I don't think that's any excuse for continued neglect. And I think we're starting to see more and more people pay attention to this and shift that course, which is something to give thanks for. But throughout the Bible, we find many relevant passages of Scripture on this topic: praise of God revealed in the beauty of nature, references to the very land that we inhabit as being a gift from God that we should both cherish and steward. Plus, there are obviously the warnings against overtaxing the land and its resources all throughout Deuteronomy. But to ask what God's will is regarding the earth and its creatures, for me, my go-to part of the Bible and Scripture is the book of Genesis, where in the stories of creation we find not scientific reporting on the world's origins, but communally discerned explorations of meaning, captured for us in story form, grasping after the profundity of what it means to be at all, the meaning of life itself, and then reflecting on the responsibilities that come with that gift that is life. And over again throughout these first verses of the Bible, God says again and again about this very world that we live in, especially New Mexico, I like to think, it is good, it is good, it is good. And furthermore, God speaks blessings over every living thing, so the birds, the fish, the insects, the mammals. God calls the entire community of creation good, and then bids that we be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. You've all heard these words before, but do you know that they are spoken over all life and not just we the people? I think this is a fact that's routinely missed. And from this, we can take that God, maybe in some ways beyond our understanding or capacity, is pleased by this world, and that this world in some way brings God glory and fulfillment by the very merit of us living and being here. And again, I invite you to filter this through whatever framework makes sense for you. But to my ears, I hear this as a challenge to the usual anthropomorphic and human-focused lens that we people tend to apply and view things through. But if we look at it all throughout Scripture, there is clearness that all parts of our world and this biosphere are blessed by its Creator, and in some way both reflect and participate in the divine life that animates all things. So if this is true, and God wills for the whole of creation to live and thrive, then what is the response that's required of us? That second question that I told you I'd get to, how are we supposed to respond? And clearly here, it's God's will for all species to live and thrive. And if this is true, then what's the takeaway? Well, first of all, we shouldn't be doing anything that hinders that ability for all species, all life to live and thrive. We shouldn't get in the way of that, or do anything that could potentially hold that living and thriving back for generations to come, which is potentially in question with this Holtec site. And when we talk about life, remember, we're not just talking about humanity, but all species. And as a Christian, I look to the life and witness of Jesus, the Christ, for the fullest revelation of God's will and ways. And what I find in Jesus is the story of a God who did not choose to remain distant, but who joined God's self to creation for the sake of its redemption and eternal union with God, the source of all life in this world. And I know that this might sound a bit preachy, but forgive me, it's kind of what I do. But again, I invite you to consider this in light of however you filter or view your own convictions. But for me, the entire arc of Jesus' life is one that reveals a framework underpinning reality that shows how we must, for the sake of all life, to live and thrive, find ways of putting the needs of others before our own. This is what Jesus does. This is what becoming flesh and one with creation means. And I think this is our calling too, to find ways of putting the needs of others before our own. A big challenge for us people, especially at this moment in history. Learning to look out for the needs of the least among us, which obviously includes those on the margins of society and the economically disadvantaged, but also the creatures that we share this planet with who have no political voice of their own and who have to rely on us. Because in this era with projects like Holtec and others, we know of humanity's capacity to do much harm very quickly. Think Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and we could probably go around the room and just add to this list. But now, in addition to ourselves, so many other species depend on the decisions that we people make and how we use the power and technology that we have developed and are now being challenged to temper and use for only good things. Good ends that enable the continued living and thriving that God has blessed and willed from the beginning. So I share all this, although I haven't got to hear our speaker yet, so maybe I will be converted tonight also. But I share this not as some kind of wholesale rejection of all things nuclear, but saying that we have good reason to weigh any kind of endeavor like this wayside project, on their merit and their morals, and whether or not they support this will and vision of God for all life to live and thrive. Does this align with God's dream for this place, for New Mexico and our world? This is the good work before us tonight, and I invite you to tap into these themes in whatever ways work for you. Ask yourself, what are the roots that underpin your concern and reason for being here? And then how are we being called to enact those values together here tonight and moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And so I'm back again. I'm Sister Joan Brown, the Executive Director of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. And I'm going to expand a little bit on what Jeremiah talked about, but more from a practitioner place of someone who is religious and working in an interfaith context with a lot of these issues of climate change and environment. And I'm going to talk about eco-justice. And I'm just going to give a snippet of background. I think most people don't realize that faith communities, ecumenical, but also others after the first Earth Day, saw that there was this conflict somehow, or tension between environment and religion, and they saw they needed to be brought together. They also saw that what needed to be brought together was care for creation and care for human people and for society. So they came up with this term eco-justice, which includes all of creation and all of human beings and society, as a way of bringing this together, that we need to be caring for all together. And that is the lens that we need to increasingly work in. So within that, there are some basic norms of eco-justice, and part of our concern about the Holtec project is because of some of these eco-justice ethics and norms. And I'm just going to briefly state them. One is solidarity with all people and creatures, and to reflect deeply upon what is going on, that all might be cared for and taken care of, so that kind of solidarity. And we do have that concern with the Holtec issue, especially with a large population of people in the southeast part of the state are Spanish-speaking, Hispanic, and there's a large poverty rate there as well. Second principle is ecological sustainability, that our habits of living and working enable life to flourish, both in humans and creatures, and that appropriate technology is used. And we're not convinced at this point that nuclear energy is appropriate technology. If we were addressing the waste from beginning to the final cycle and it was taken care of and it wasn't harmful, we could go there. At this point, we do not have that in place. Sufficiency is a standard for organizing and sharing, and that's fair consumption for all. And then the final is socially just participation in decisions about how we come to agreements, and it is for the common good. And with this project thus far, there haven't been any hearings in New Mexico, even though there have been some hearings, information shared at other hearings throughout other parts of the country. So we're feeling a little bit left out, and this project is going to be in southeast New Mexico. And to add to this, we in New Mexico do not even have any nuclear power plants. So those are the principles. And so we need to look at this holistically. And I found it rather interesting. One of our own ethicists here in the state, Larry Rasmussen, who lives in Santa Fe now, and he's taught at Union Theological, speaks a lot about these kind of ethics. Added to that, there is an Indian woman, Vandana Shiva, who has also written about these, and she has coined a word called earth democracy. And in that, it relocates the sanctity of life in all beings and all people, irrespective of class, gender, religion, or caste. And it redefines upholding family values as respecting limits on greed and violence, and that is the belonging to the earth family and to this common home, our earth. Jumping a little forward ahead, in 2015, Pope Francis had in Laudato Si spoke to all of these challenges. And he said that today we have to realize that true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And he says everything is connected. And so in this issue, we see that all are connected, including our brothers and sisters, where the transportation is coming through a variety of, or planned through a variety of cities, and Native American lands, reservations, etc., as well as oftentimes rails go through the poorer sections of communities in addition. So I also wanted to share, and I was very surprised to find this when I did a little research, because I didn't think that there were any statements by religious leaders that were very specific to this nuclear power issue and the repercussions of that with waste. But Pope Francis in 2015 visited with the Japanese bishops, and he was there visiting with them about nuclear energy and nuclear power. And he criticized nuclear power, and he compared it to the Tower of Babel. And that was as reported by Takeo Okada, the Archbishop of Tokyo, saying when human beings attempted to reach heaven, they triggered their own destruction. Human beings should not break the natural laws set by God. So he was addressing that very clearly. And this is the first clear-cut criticism that I found very specific of the civil use of nuclear power issued by the Vatican. The Pope expressed his conviction. While there has been reservation expressed for nuclear weapons by the Vatican in more the recent years after the just war theory. So given that, I'm going to turn it over to Don in just a second, but I just want to again address those eco-justice concerns, and that is that the people living in southeast New Mexico, that we are called to be in solidarity with them, and that there are disproportionately minority and low economic families. We don't see that this solution, as it is addressed right now, is safe. We have questions about safety, and that means the health of the environment of the creatures that God has created, and also humans, nor is it a sustainable solution, and you know, questions about the economic viability of it as well. Also see this as an eco-justice issue with rural and urban divide, which I come from rural Kansas, and so I understand that a great deal and see discrimination with where we put things and where we do things, and it's more with the rural areas than the urban areas in some cases. Also a concern for the workers and the health workers and long term, and in addition, for intergenerational justice, which is an increasing concern. Those who are children now, those who are not born, those who will be born way, way into the future. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Dawn now. I know this always happens.
It's just that it's very hard.
Yeah, it's just this.
And then you pick up your voicemail.
The other half, I think, is to switch on the other side.
There, okay.
At the risk of everybody going to sleep, you can probably see a little better if the lights are down. We are going to have a significant amount of time for questions and answers because I hope you'll be thinking about both the ethical and moral issues that you've just heard talked about, as well as some of the practical aspects, or what I consider the basic aspects of the Holtec proposal. For those of you who don't know, I'm Don Hancock at Southwest Research and Information Center, which is a private nonprofit organization based in Albuquerque, but we do work in other parts of the state and other parts of the world, and sometimes we say we work southwest of anywhere. The organization was founded in 1971. Among the many environmental health and environmental justice issues we've worked on for a long time are nuclear waste issues. So I appreciate your coming to learn more about this, and I appreciate New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light for putting it on. So what is the proposal that Holtec has? The basic concept is Holtec, as we're going to talk about, talks about bringing all of the nation's commercial spent fuel to New Mexico. So where is all of the nation's commercial spent fuel located now? Is a basic point to start. Well, it's at nuclear power plants. And you can see from this map, just looking at the map, you would say, well, they're overwhelmingly in the eastern part of the country, and as you see at the right-hand side, 94% of the currently operating nuclear power reactors are east of the 100th meridian, kind of running right down the middle of the country. And about 92% of the commercial spent fuel that we're talking about is also east of the 100th meridian. So the issue of nuclear waste, commercial nuclear waste, it comes from producing electricity from nuclear power plants, of course. And those power plants are currently and have historically been very much in the eastern part of the country, which of course raises the question of, should it be coming to the west, Mexico or
I'm
elsewhere?
sorry, but I can't hear you back here.
Well, that's kind of strange, Janet, that you can't hear me.
Now I can hear you, now that you're closer.
Okay, so before we talk about the specifics, I think two kind of basic questions are important to think about. One is safety, and we've heard about that from a moral ethical standpoint. If this commercial spent fuel is safe where it is, and we've just talked about where it is, if it's safe where it is, why is there any need? Why should it come to New Mexico? It's kind of a very basic question. If it's safe where it is, why does it need to move? Why would it be safer here than where it is? Secondly, sometimes there's discussion about this could be good economics. So the second basic question is, if waste storage is good for the economy, why did those nuclear reactor communities, where it is now, not want to keep it? Why do they want to get rid of all this good economic aspect? So these are a couple of very basic questions. I've asked them many times to some of the most important nuclear executives in the country. And I haven't gotten very satisfactory answers. Okay, so Holtec. The Holtec site is about, as you can see from this map, we're talking southeastern New Mexico, as you've heard. It's almost exactly midway. The site's almost exactly midway between Carlsbad and Hobbs, just off of US Highway 62. It's just in Lee County, not far in, so it's very close to the boundary of Eddy and Lee counties. So to get to, among the things that need to happen to have what's called consolidated storage, bringing this fuel from where it is licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to operate and be safe, one has to get another license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to do this consolidated storage. So Holtec formally started this process by submitting an application on March 31st of 2017, almost exactly a year ago. We're just less than 2 weeks away from the year. Two major documents that they submitted, as you can see, are an environmental report that's supposed to talk about the environmental issues related to their proposal. That report is 543 pages. And what's called a safety analysis report, how safe would this be? As you can see, that's 536 pages. And then in addition, there are a variety of other documents, although Sister Joan referred earlier to information. Some of these other reports, like the life cycle cost document, the decommissioning document, were released only in the last 2 weeks, even though they were filed in March of last year. They were released only in the last 2 weeks as a result of a Freedom of Information Act request. So that's an issue about, even in terms of what's in the application, how much is known. But basic things in the application, it calls for bringing 100,000 metric tons of commercial spent fuel in the form of 500 canisters per year for 20 years, starting in the year 2022. And I'm going to talk some more about those things in a minute. But again, back to the context, you saw the map of where the commercial spent fuel is. How much commercial spent fuel is there? About 80,000 metric tons is what exists today as we speak. So when they size their facility to handle 100,000 metric tons, what does that tell you? They want to bring all that currently exists and all of what's going to be produced over the next several years to New Mexico. So again, that's an important concept. Are we talking about a little bit of what's there? Are we talking about a lot? Or are we talking about Holtec's proposal is it all, to bring it all? How does it get here? How would it get here? Again, you saw it's all over the country. It would come on trains. And I'm going to come back to this, but again, just a factual number that comes out of their documents. A loaded transport cask, each of those casks that are bringing one of these 500 canisters, each rail car cask weighs between 371,000 pounds and 414,800 pounds. So we're going to talk some more about, those are pretty heavy. First question is, why are they so heavy? Because what they're trying to contain, the spent fuel, is so hot and so highly radioactive that it needs to have a lot of shielding to protect workers on the railroad and people that would be passing through. So it has to be very heavy for shielding standpoint. Holtec also says in their application, well, their initial license application is for 40 years. They clearly say in the application that, well, this is supposed to be temporary. It's not where it's supposed to be forever. It's supposed to come temporarily to be stored here and then move sometime in the future to a permanent disposal site. But they say in their application they feel confident that it could stay where it is for at the site in New Mexico for 120 years. Now, from a biblical context that we've heard about from Jeremiah and Joan, 120,000 years, or 120 years is not biblical time. But for most of our lifetime, that seems a little more than temporary. And there's also the question of where is that permanent space to put it, since it doesn't currently exist. And we can talk about later if people want to, but there's really no good site on the horizon. So what does it look like now? It looks like a lot of southeastern New Mexico on the upper right. A couple of other things from the application, and these don't show up really well, but just to illustrate the point. The lower left talks about mineral resources and near the site. And while they don't have a legend that goes with this figure, interestingly enough, the yellow places that you see are oil wells and gas wells that are close by. There's a quarry there. You can see there are a variety of water bodies that basically come from potash mining that is going on about 6 miles away and has been going on historically. And then who owns the land around here? The lower right shows, again, the kind of the more green shaded is their proposed site at a little more than 1,000 acres. And most of the land around it is Bureau of Land Management. It's federal land, our land, managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The bluish sections that you see are New Mexico state land. So there's very little private land. It's mostly BLM land and some state land around. So in terms of who's there, what's there, yes, go away. Oops, sorry. Okay, so this is their drawing of what the site would look like once we have the 10,000 cast there. And you can see that it's mostly a little bit below ground. You can see the figures, so those are people. So you can see the top of the canisters that we've talked about that would come, 500 a year, would be just below the ground, up to about 25 feet below the ground, up to just to the top of the ground. They argue the reason to do that is putting it in the ground provides some extra security and stability, and it also addresses an issue that sometimes comes up. Well, if somebody was coming in and trying to do something from a security standpoint, they would be easily visible because people would be standing up a lot higher than what the storage containers would be. So this is their view of the storage canister, and you can see kind of the top of the picture is what you saw above ground, and then in the ground and below ground how the canisters would be. And as we've talked about, they talk about 10,000 of these coming over 20 years. How do they get here? This is their, what Holtec calls their high star 190 transport cask. Again, these are their drawings, but to give you a little context, on the left you see the cask where the container would be. It's about between 16 and almost 18 feet long, so these are massive. Internal diameter of a little over 6 feet, external diameter of almost 9 feet. So these are massive, again, part of the reason why they're heavy. And then on the right is you put the canister in this bigger transport cask, which is where we get the 371,000 to 414,000 pounds of how to transport it. So you may ask, well, do these things exist? From Holtec's standpoint, the good news is they have a license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for these two casks. So from their standpoint, they do exist, they do work, they could have them. They, of course, have not manufactured the 500, let alone the 10,000. So railroads are important, and again, this won't show up too well, I think. But this is the railroad map of New Mexico. And the green line kind of down through the center, Raton, down by Santa Fe, Belen, down to the bottom, and the green line going across are the BNSF railway. That is considered to be a Class 1 railroad. And the other Class 1 railroad in the state is the Union Pacific, which is the red line that you see coming through Tucumcari, Santa Rosa, Vaughn, Alamogordo, down to El Paso, and then going west into Arizona. So those are the two basic commercial railroad lines that we have in the state. The other lines that you see there are classified as Class 3 railroads. They carry a lot less traffic generally, and as you can see, there are a couple of lines that go into southeastern New Mexico, but they're not these Class 1 lines. 2 points I want to make about this. Obviously, how is it going to get there? It's going to have to take some roundabout ways. Holtec says they're going to build a railroad spur from this line that comes east off of Carlsbad down in the southeast into their site. But the Union Pacific, the red line, are rated at gross weight maximum of 286,000 pounds. What's the weight of the transportation cask? Considerably more than 286,000 pounds.
Plus the truck.
Well, there's, yeah, no, the gross weight includes the rail car in this case. So there's a problem. And you might ask, well, how does Holtec address that problem? And the answer is, in the application that they submitted, they don't address the problem. They don't discuss the problem. But it is one of the kinds of issues that's important, not just to make the site work, but for people not only in New Mexico, but around the country in terms of whether this works or not. So another, and we will get to questions in a minute, but let me talk about a couple more things. So, can they do this? So the current law says, which is called the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, says that the polluter should pay for nuclear waste storage. In this case, the nuclear power plants should pay. And so they currently are paying for the storage where it is and would pay for any kind of private consolidated storage like the Holtec site would be. However, the Holtec application says that the Department of Energy, federal government, would pay for the transportation costs. Problem is that's clearly prohibited by current federal law. So that law would have to be changed for this proposal to actually work. So if consolidated storage is a good idea, did anybody else ever think about it before Holtec? Yes. Those of you who were around more than 20 years ago in New Mexico, we remember it was actually talked about to do it in New Mexico in the 1990s on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, where some utility companies had an agreement with the tribe to try to do it then. There was a lot of opposition from the tribe and other folks, and that proposal was dropped. And so instead, 8 nuclear utilities went to Utah, west of Salt Lake City in Tuala County, and submitted, as you can see, a license application. In 2006, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission gave them a 20-year license to store up to 40,000 metric tons of the fuel, a very significant amount, not as much as Holtec's currently proposing, but a significant amount. So that site's been licensed for more than a decade. Has it been used? No, not at all. So it is licensed, but it isn't operating because of a lot of opposition. The opposition was such that a new wilderness area was created to prevent transportation to the site, and as a result of that, the Bureau of Land Management wouldn't grant access right-of-way to bring waste into that site, and because it was on tribal land, Indian land, the Goshute, Skull Valley Band of Goshutes, the BIA wouldn't also approve the lease to do it, so you have a licensed site that doesn't work. So, where does that leave us in New Mexico? I mentioned almost a year ago there was this license application. There hasn't been a public process yet, but there will be. We don't know for sure exactly when, but sometime probably fairly soon, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will issue 2 notices. One is to say we will accept public comments for, typically they only allow 45 days, which some of us think is not very long for something like this, but there will be a comment period that's mostly on the environmental report that I referred to earlier, what's called scoping. What are the issues that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission should consider, both what Holtec talks about and are there other things that should be considered in an environmental impact statement. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has said there will be 2 or 3 public meetings in southeastern New Mexico during that comment period, and one in Hobbs, one in Carlsbad, and perhaps a third one, we won't know until they make their announcement, but perhaps a third one in Roswell. The second thing they'll do, because this is a legal and technical process to go through and get a license or not, there will be a second process which allows people who think they are directly affected by Holtec, the proposal, and who have objections, what are called in Nuclear Regulatory Commission standpoint contentions, to file those to say we want these issues to be heard in depth over whatever period of time, usually it's 2 or 3 years, during the licensing process. So, does it make any difference what people think? I think the answer is yes. I mentioned the private fuel storage example where the Nuclear Regulatory Commission arguably ignored a lot of the public concerns and the concerns of the state of Utah. But because of that opposition, regardless of the license, it couldn't go forward. And there's another proposal just across the state line, only about 40 miles away from the Holtec site, Waste Control Specialists, right on the Texas-New Mexico boundary, which a year earlier had submitted a similar license application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And last year, WCS, and these are quotes from them last April, WCS respectfully requests that the NRC temporarily suspend all safety and environmental review activities as well as public participation activities because, they went on to say, WCS also is faced with a magnitude of financial burdens that currently make the pursuit of licensing unsupportable. This is so because following the recent docketing of the application in January 2017, the cost profile of WCS's pursuit has increased dramatically. They went on to say part of the reason the cost increased dramatically is because there was so much public comment in opposition to it. So on the handout on the table, I have a longer list of resources. including from Holtec, where if you want to plow through these technical documents that Holtec is where you can find those, where some of the community opposition to Holtec has some of their concerns, and where and Holtec's website where they talk about in more detail about why this is a good idea. This is how you can contact me, and why don't we see what questions people have so we can talk about this a little bit more. Thank you. Sister Joan has a mic, so if you want to ask questions, so that everybody can hear and it can be recorded.
Are there, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Are there rail lines in the United States that can transport containers this heavy?
Only a few. Most rail lines in the country are designed to go up over 300,000 pounds, but again, these are heavier than that. And again, the reason they're heavy, they were not designed to fit on the railroads necessarily. They're designed to try to contain the radioactivity, the very significant amounts of radioactivity. So this is going to be a real problem. This is not a new issue. It's an issue that's been talked about for a while, that the transportation is going to be a big issue and a big problem, and weight, in addition to the radioactivity, is going to be a big problem. So it is going to be a problem. About 6 or 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, there was something, and again, it's on the reference sheet if people want to look at it, called the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future that President Obama set up to kind of look at how to deal with nuclear waste issues. And they had to talk about this issue of transportation, and railroad companies and railroad workers said at the time, this is going to be a real problem to transport because the railroad lines, regardless of what their capacity, are always in very good condition. And when you start talking about running this kind of weight on them, that's going to deteriorate the railroad lines, and so maintenance is going to be higher, et cetera, et cetera. So this is going to be a very expensive proposition, not only to bring it to New Mexico, but to move it any place.
That's good.
Let me take some over here, then I'll go to the other side.
Yeah.
What's the rationale for asking the DOE to pay for all of this?
Well, because Holtec doesn't have enough money to pay for it all. As I mentioned, WCS, Waste Control Specialist, the other site, which has even less money, but thought they might have enough money to carry forward with this until DOE would pay it all. Just the cost of the licensing, the millions of dollars to go through the licensing process, was too much for them. Holtec, just to give you one number, one of the new documents that came out as a result of this Freedom of Information Act request that I mentioned in the last couple of weeks, is what's called the life cycle cost. You know, what does the whole thing cost? What Holtec said in that is the rail lines, for their proposal, would cost just under $13 million. Now, presumably, it's not explained in that document where they came up with that number, but presumably that number is what they project the cost of building a 3.5-mile rail spur from existing line that comes out of Carlsbad that serves the potash mines to their site. But again, that is arguably not anyways near close to all the cost that the building up the rail lines would be. So again, these are the kinds of questions that people say they haven't really answered in their application, and they're going to have to be dealt with.
Yeah, I heard a radio report on this morning. Apparently that disinformation's already started, because on the radio report they said the actual disposal site was to be in Texas and not in New Mexico.
So one of the,
that was on NPR.
So one of the things that could happen, I mentioned the fact that WCS asked almost a year ago to suspend their license. In the meantime, to avoid going bankrupt, they have been sold to a new company, which has indicated in the press that they're going to restart this WCS licensing process, which I didn't hear the report you mentioned, but could well be part of what's going on there. So we could, unfortunately, people who are concerned about this could unfortunately be faced with going through two of these processes pretty simultaneously. And again, in terms of disparity of resources and some of the issues that Sister Joan talked about, the disproportionate amount of resources that the federal government with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission have and Holtec has versus what the rest of us have is clearly going to be an issue, and if those resources are stretched even more broadly for two processes at once, it'll be even more difficult for people to have their views be known, but that doesn't mean we won't do it. And some of you hopefully will decide you want to help.
Yes, in my readings, I've noticed that they said if it goes by rail, the law of averages on the miles covered from the east to the west, etc., the law of averages says there will be train accidents. And how do they address that?
In their application and their documents, they don't address that. I think, so several things to remember about railroads. Holtec is not a railroad company. Railroad companies are great in this country are private companies. So among other things, they would need a contract with the NSF or UP or somebody to do that. They don't have that. So how much it's really going to cost, nobody knows. But the point is that that's going to be an issue. In terms of people ask me, well, what are the routes that they're going to use? We saw railroad lines in New Mexico, which of those are going to use, which of them are they ain't going to use. You can look at a national map and say the same kind of things. Well, as a practical matter, railroads are private. The railroad companies decide what routes things take. They don't always take the most direct route. Are these big casks going to be on a train that's carrying other things? Probably so, because the way the companies make their money is hauling freight. So again, what is going to be on this train that's carrying the nuclear waste canisters? If it's food, are you going to be excited about your food being close to a large amount of radiation and a smaller amount of radiation that penetrates even the big cask? What if it's explosive petroleum or other kinds of things which get transported on the rail lines too? So the answer is no, they don't address those things. My guess is, and this is what we'll find out in the next few years, Holtec is basically going to say, I think, that transportation is irrelevant. What they're asking for is a license to operate this facility for these 10,000 canisters in southeastern New Mexico. And that's the only thing that really should be looked at. And transportation really isn't an issue. Of course, a lot of people around the country and in New Mexico are going to say, well, it doesn't just miraculously get from where it is to New Mexico, so it's got to be transported, and so it isn't. And it won't be transported to Holtec if Holtec isn't going forward. So I think transportation will be an issue, but in what I would consider to be the kind of arcane Nuclear Regulatory Commission process, how much it's going to be considered remains to be seen.
Okay, I'm going to move to this other side. Before I do though, I want to bring a question from
one of our faith leaders with New Mexico Interfaith County Life, who is the southeast part of the state. And he keeps asking me, well, I'm a little concerned about the state of the government right now, and what is funded and what is not funded. What about the security of the actual site and over the long haul, and what if there's not enough money in the budget of the United States, or something else happens? What does this have to be guarded? Does it have to be, what is the security?
So you may be able to see in their drawing, there is a barbed wire fence to keep people out, and yes, there would be security guards. In fact, most of the jobs in this kind of facility are the security jobs, because the idea, and I want to go back because I kind of skipped over it. The idea is Holtec, in their application, uses the phrase, this facility will start clean and stay clean. These canisters that we talked about are sealed up at the power plants. They're put in these transport casks. They're transported across the country to Holtec. They're unloaded from the transport cask, and they are put into each of these places. So they never open them up, so they're all sealed, so don't worry about risks or accidents or whatever. And so so it's not like they have any need to have major facilities at the site. So they have a security building, they have the building where they unload the rail car and move it to here, and basically an administration building. But that's kind of all there is to it. And so, so there aren't a lot of people, so it's not a lot of jobs. So that's the security during the 40 years, 120 years, etc. they have. Security guards guarding it. They hope, of course, that the federal government would take responsibility for this, and then it would be the federal government's responsibility. But I mentioned one thing that they tried to do to say to improve the security is to have them mostly below ground for security, so people who are trying to shoot RPGs or who knows what into them or damage them somehow wouldn't be able to do that. But yes, the fundamental issue is the waste that we're talking about will be very dangerous for thousands of generations. So when we talk about, and the faith leader you're talking about, who I've talked to as well, says, you know, now we are talking about biblical time. 120 years doesn't seem like biblical time, but thousands of generations does seem like biblical time. And what actually is around that long? Is the government, is the U.S. or any other government around that long? You guys have as good answers to that as I do, or maybe better.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. One, you shared with us a map illustrating the distribution of nuclear power plants in the United States. My question is, where are the majority of nuclear waste storage sites located? And my second question is, have there been successful campaigns by communities where nuclear storage, waste storage sites are located or proposed to be located? Have they launched successful campaigns demanding that they not be placed in those communities, whether through the legal process or through direct action? Can either of those approaches provide a model for the people of southeastern Mexico to follow?
Those could be very long answers. So let me try to be brief, much as I sometimes have difficulty being brief. There are three major places where high-level defense waste from nuclear weapons are located. In Hanford, Washington, up in the upper corner, close to where the Columbia Generating Station is, which is the commercial power plant there. The Hanford Reservation is right by, or the Columbia Generation Station, because Hanford was created first. The Columbia Generating Station is right by the Hanford Reservation, which is a 300 square mile site where there are 177 tanks of liquid high-level waste, so highly radioactive waste. So that's the place that has the most by volume of nuclear weapons high-level waste. In South Carolina, down here where you see lots of nuclear power plants as well, is the Savannah River site, which is the second major defense high-level waste site, which has the most defense high-level waste measured by radioactivity. Remember I mentioned Hanford has the most volume. Savannah River site has a little more radioactivity than Hanford does. And then the third place that has the third other site, federal government site, Department of Energy site, is Idaho National Lab in Idaho. It has a significantly lesser amount of high-level waste, but it also has a significant amount. So those are the three places that have it. In terms of your second question, I just spent the last 3 days in Chicago with people from around a number of the power plant sites. So in some cases, people who've been fighting to prevent the power plants from being built in the first place 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and who've been talking about what should happen with the waste at those sites for a long time. So kind of a couple of answers to the question. There's some people in the room are old enough to remember Seabrook in New Hampshire.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that was an example of direct action trying to stop it 40 years ago. Seabrook actually ended up operating for a while. And a lot of these power plants, there was a lot of opposition to the license, sometimes direct action or not, in the 70s and 80s when most of these plants were built. Some of those were successful. Some of the plants that were being proposed 40 years ago weren't built, but many of them were. So you can judge for yourself, is the cup half full or half empty? Everybody in the room is old enough to remember the George W. Bush administration. The George W. Bush administration had a proposal for a nuclear renaissance. These plants, with two exceptions, these plants have all been operating for 20 years or more, so there haven't been new plants for a while. So the Bush administration said, we need more nuclear power plants. And so they proposed what they called the nuclear renaissance, and there were going to be, depending on which thing you looked at, but there were going to be somewhere on the order of 36 nuclear power plants online by about 2015 or 2016. None of those plants are actually online because of two primary things, in some cases opposition, but the primary thing was economics. These plants are not economic. They're very expensive to build, leaving aside the waste issue. They take a long time to build, and in the last 15 years, new electric generating plants are not coal plants or nuclear plants, they're gas plants, wind, and solar primarily. And also, we, in some cases, are learning to be more efficient with our electricity, and so therefore we need fewer plants. So there's more, but that's a start. I guess the one other thing I want to say that really is very important. I mentioned, in general, a lot of the pressure to do this consolidated storage is from folks, including the companies, that don't want to keep the waste. Send it to New Mexico, send it to Utah, send it to Texas, send it to wherever, right? Get it out of here. It's very important to recognize, and I've spent time with them, including this last weekend, there are a number of folks around all of these, essentially around all of these power plants that's shown here, who have taken what I consider the moral, ethical, principle position of, we've created this mess, even if we opposed creating it in the first place. We're going to have to take responsibility for it. We don't like the fact that it's going to stay where it is, and it needs to be more safely stored where it is, but that's what's going to need to happen, and we need to come up with some better ways of doing that. So there are a lot of people who take that position, and I'll point out on the back of this sheet, near the bottom, Principles for Safeguarding Nuclear Waste at Reactors, is a statement that community groups in all 50 states have signed on this principle of, rather than saying we're going to ship it to New Mexico or Texas or someplace, or ship it to Nevada for the Yucca Mountain supposed disposal site, we need to take responsibility that's going to have to stay where it is for some considerable period of time. Hopefully not forever, but for at least several decades.
Who else has questions over here? Okay, let's run through some more questions quickly. And here, let's start here.
Thank you. The earlier comment about accidents, there was an article that said over 20 years the Sierra Club, I guess, was the one that there would be 10 major accidents on the rail line. That's not my question, I was just giving up. My question is, you look at that map, and I count about 30, my eyes aren't that good, about 30 states that have stored fuel right now.
31.
31, oh, pretty good. That's 60 senators, and highly populated states, they have more than 3 representatives, like New Mexico, so I would guess around 200 representatives. If that voting group block wants to get rid of the waste and send it out west, that's a political reality. How do you work on that?
So 2 things. The law that I mentioned here, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, was originally passed in 1982. It was amended in 1987. In 1989, among the fundamental amendments in 1987 was, well, let me back up. The original 82 Act said we needed multiple geologic repositories, multiple deep geologic repositories to safeguard this stuff for thousands of generations. And they should be both in the east and the west. Geographic diversity as well. The technical, mostly technical consensus in the United States and around the world is when you're talking about things that are dangerous for thousands of generations, you know, what do you want to do? You want to make it as inaccessible as possible, so the monitoring and the security is less of a problem, so putting it deep underground is the idea, and so that's, you know, that's what that law said. So the Department of Energy started a process to look around for sites around the country that might fit the bill. And there was, guess what? Lots of opposition from all over the country as they looked around for sites. So in 1987, basically what you were suggesting, the 535 greatest geologists in the country, members of Congress, decided they knew best and they would pick a site to be the disposal site. And they picked Yucca Mountain in Nevada. Because at the time, Nevada had 2 senators and 2 representatives, wasn't very powerful, and so, you know, when the politicians got together, well, who wants this? Nobody wanted it, so stick it to Nevada. That law said, that was 1987, that law said that Yucca Mountain was going to open by January 31 of 1998. 20 years ago. Yucca Mountain is not open. So even though the politicians may want to say something's going to happen, that doesn't make it so, because this is a very difficult problem. I mean, consolidated storage in New Mexico or not, if New Mexico wasn't being proposed, you all probably wouldn't be interested, but if we were here, we would be talking about how difficult this problem is every place else in the country, even though it's, you know, New Mexico isn't being targeted. So it's a very serious problem. So I think politically there are a couple of things that are worthwhile saying. Senator Bingaman, who was a longtime New Mexico senator, as people know, who was pretty actively involved in that 1987 law, and didn't necessarily like it very much, although he did like the part of geologic disposal. He hated the part of consolidated storage. And And that's part of the reason the law says you can't do private consolidated storage, because he and a lot of other people thought that was a bad idea. So there are lots of people who understand that, back to what we heard early on, when we're talking thousands of generations, it's not really just up to us currently to make these decisions. Are we really thinking about, there was the mention of the 7 generations from the Iroquois in our opening. Who represents those future generations down the line? And there are a few, fortunately, members of Congress that think they ought to think a little more about that than just sort of quick and easy kind of thing. But Holtec, in their most optimistic means, says it's going to take them 20 years to get all this stuff here. So that doesn't sound like an immediate solution, you know, even though that's the fastest one being proposed by anybody. So I think the answer is, so just to summarize, I think the politics are going to be difficult, but the 1987 law is 30 years old. It was clear 20 years ago, long before 1998, that it wasn't going to work. Congress has known that, but hasn't been able to figure out what else to do. And so we're still where we are. And so that's why people like Holtec argue, well, okay, Congress can't figure it out, so help us do this and change the law so, you know, it'll let us do that. The law hasn't been changed because it's not a slam dunk even in Congress with people who have these various ideas. The last thing I should say, you people are smart politically. Who else is playing in this game? The nuclear industry we talked about. Well, the nuclear industry themselves are not of one mind about this. And so one of the reasons it's been hard for Congress to do anything is the Holtecs of the world want to do consolidated storage or repositories because they're going to make their money from making the storage and transportation gas.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But everybody knows that if you're moving the stuff, you're creating a site to store it and moving it once, and then moving it from that temporary site to someplace else, does that cost more than moving it once? So, you know, so there are people, some people who think they're going to have to pay for it say, no, let's not do this consolidated storage kind of thing.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions. I know you have a lot of good questions. Let's take 2 more questions so then we can wrap up with what can we do, okay? So who wants to be the 2?
Well, I have several questions, but okay, one is there any technology that talks about reusing this stuff so we don't have all this waste? Is there anything out there like that? And then whose bright idea is to consolidate it? Is it Holtec, or is it, I think you kind of answered some of it, that not all the companies feel the same. So it sounds like Holtec's trying to get this going and get all the politicians and all the companies in New Mexico to agree with that. Okay, and well, we'll take those 2.
So it's primarily Holtec. The company, the private company that's working with waste control specialists, a site in Texas, is Areva, or it's just recently been named Orano, which is the French company, because sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, the French have this figured out because they do know how to recycle it. Actually, they don't. What the French do is what's called reprocessing, which is to take the fuel and rather than putting it in a container to ship it to New Mexico or leave it at the power plants, they put it in acid, cut it up into pieces to pull out the uranium and some of the plutonium that's in the spent fuel so they can use it again in nuclear power plants, which sounds like a little bit of reusing, but that mess, that liquid mess that they create is a huge amount of volume and also continues to maintain a lot of the radioactivity. So that's really not a solution. The French have done that, the British have done it to some extent, the Russians certainly do it. The United States did it in the late 60s and early 70s, but not for very long commercially, because the company that did it very quickly went bankrupt because it was economically it makes no sense. But the environmental contamination of this little bit of reprocessing, commercial reprocessing in West Valley, New York, the site has been closed down for almost 40 years, and the taxpayers, we taxpayers and the taxpayers of New York State are still paying millions of dollars every year to just contain the contamination that's there, not clean it up and fix it. So reprocessing, which sometimes gets called recycling, is A, not recycling, and B, it's an economic and environmental disaster. So I'll do a little plug for one more thing on my resource sheet. People sometimes ask, well, hasn't somebody figured this out? The United States has more nuclear waste than anybody else except maybe Russia, the former Soviet Union, but hasn't somebody figured it out? Well, the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, which is an independent government body, did a very good report just about 2 years ago that surveyed the programs of other nuclear nations to see how they're doing with this. And as you'll see, if you look at this, nobody has figured it out. As I mentioned earlier, there's kind of this technical consensus that deep geologic repositories are the way to do it. Nobody has an operating deep geologic repository in the world. So it is a very difficult problem. The smart politicians know it's a difficult problem, which is one of the reasons they want to stay away from it, probably.
Just a question for you, Dylan. I've been over at Humboldt Bay, and the dry cask storage there is 44 feet above sea level, on an earthquake fault zone, in a tsunami zone. And the question I have is, it's a decommissioned power plant, and it's got a hazard that's known at this point. Is the responsibility at some point in time say, we really don't want to have this end up in the Pacific Ocean somewhere when the next major Cascadia earthquake falls? They said that dry cask was only good for 60 years. So what do you do at the end of 2068?
So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission disagrees. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission thinks and is willing to license and has publicly said dry storage can work for a lot longer than 60 years. So again, that's, we can debate. We don't have any commercial storage in the United States that's been going on for 60 years because the first commercial nuclear power plant was shipping port in Pennsylvania. So we don't have history with dry storage or any other kind of storage lasting 60 years or 120 years yet. I thought you might mention the even more ridiculous California situation, which is San Onofre, which is not 44 feet, but more like about 12 feet, depending on where the tide is, from the Pacific Ocean. And that's a current crazy proposal that's out there. And some of the politics right now driving things is folks in San Onofre saying, get it out of here, send it to New Mexico or Texas or we don't care where, but send it someplace. It shouldn't be on the beach. So the answer to that goes back to what we talked about earlier. And several people from California were at this meeting I was at in Chicago over the weekend, and we were talking about these things, of course. Yes, leaving it in dry storage or wet storage near, wet storage in an earthquake area where the fuel pools can get hit by earthquakes. Fukushima was tsunamis, leaving reactors, fuel or otherwise, by the ocean is not a good idea in Japan or the United States or anyplace else. But there are higher, drier, safer places closer to the Pacific Ocean than New Mexico. In the case of San Onofre, a variety of people but more importantly, some people in the area say, gee, we have a nice Marine base just across the highway from San Onofre. Wouldn't that be a safe place to secure it for a long time? And it's also higher up, much higher. You're familiar with that area. It's much higher up from the ocean. So yeah, the answer is those of us who feel like safety is important don't want to have bad wet storage in pools at reactors or bad dry storage at the plants or in New Mexico or any place else. That's why, as I say, these principles of safeguarding that I mentioned earlier talked about something called hardened on-site storage, where you protect them. If they need to be moved, move them a little bit, but as close as possible to where they are, rather than long distances across the country, because transportation is going to be a real problem, whether it's coming to New Mexico or someplace else. So, and there's a raging debate about, how good dry cask is or should be, whether you want to get it out of the pools and into dry cask. Humboldt Bay is a closed-down plant, so it's in Northern California on this map, so it doesn't show on this map because it's a closed-down plant. These are the operating plants. But yes, it's clearly a problem. The fun little joke that we talk about with Humboldt Bay, when they talk about moving the dry cask and the waste out of Humboldt Bay, do you know how they say they're going to move it? They're going to take it to the ocean and put it on a barge. And I say, gee, you can maybe get it on the barge and you can maybe get it in the Pacific, but that barge coming to New Mexico is going to have a lot of trouble.
Don, thank you for that bit of humor to close. But we are going to talk just for a second, a couple suggestions of what people might do, and Don, I'm going to have you do that. But I failed to thank Debbie O'Malley for being here tonight, one of our county commissioners. And so she's here to inform herself, and we're very grateful for that. So thank you for staying for that whole meeting. And we are counting on you to bring this information back to the rest of the county commission. So thank you. And so, Don, do you want to talk about what might happen next that people might be able to do?
So, two or three things. One is, I mentioned this Nuclear Regulatory Commission process. I have a very low opinion of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Those of you in New Mexico who know anything about uranium mining might know that my organization and local folks did a 15-year licensing fight against new uranium in situ mines in western New Mexico in the Church Rock area near Gallup and the Crown Point area. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission literally said, well, if the drinking water is contaminated by this project, it would be Navajo drinking water and they should take care of it. So, as I say, I have a low opinion of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Having said that, some people I think can and should, and I and other people will help them participate to some extent in that legal process that we talked about. But, back to Sister Joan's point, there hasn't been a lot of public discussion about this. There haven't been any public meetings, etc. There are going to be public meetings in New Mexico, as I mentioned, probably in the next couple of months. People who want to go to those can certainly go and say that they have concerns, whether they're ethical or moral or whatever, to get those on record. People, if you can't go to those, as I mentioned, there's going to be this public comment section. We already established a goal of wanting 10,000 comments to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission during this written process that hasn't yet started, but is going to start. So that's something that's important to do. The WCS one, remember they got bogged down because of all the comments. They had almost 7,000 comments at WCS to help bog them down. So we're gonna bog them down more than that. But also, politicians do make a difference. Remember, the law is not on Holtec's side. They got to change the law. So those of you who saw the front page of the Albuquerque Journal on Saturday know that most of the New Mexico congressional delegation said they do not support this Holtec proposal. They have said in other contexts, not in the article, but in other contexts, they've said, and no, they don't support changing the law either. So that's a good start. If you have friends and neighbors in other parts of the world, parts of the country, let them know that this is a bad idea. So for politicians to make a difference. We actually expect and hope in the next year or so, Holtec, which was involved, not as the lead, but they were going to build the containers for the private fuel storage, the Utah site that I mentioned, that got licensed. So Holtec has been through one example where they get a license and they still can't operate, so that's not really that's not very good economics even for a private company that's not on the stock market. So we think if they get a clear enough message that New Mexico is in fact not going to go for this, the licensing process actually could stop before it even gets to the end result. And certainly if we have the people of New Mexico saying they don't like it and public officials of New Mexico saying they don't like it, that will make a difference. I do need to quickly hasten to add that one of the things Holtec says in their license application is they have lots of support because they have a 2015 letter from Governor Martinez saying that this would be an okay idea. So people can do that. People can support. Sister Joan's been doing a great job, and some other people in the room have been doing a great job supporting the people in southeastern New Mexico. There are people in southeastern New Mexico that think this is a good idea. So if you don't think it's a good idea and you're down there challenging some of the political and economic establishment, that's tough. So we need to support the folks down there who need to and want to carry forward the opposition. We in the rest of the state need to educate our friends and neighbors. Again, the Journal had an article on Saturday, letters to the editor to say, gee, thank you for doing that article. We're interested. Let's talk some more about what's going on with this. Is a helpful thing to do. So get the word out. Participate. Help the folks who are working on this. Again, there's contact information on the written sheet that's over here that I encourage people to take.
Okay, and just thanks, Don, a lot. Just to add to that, Interfaith Power and Life, we have been circulating a letter to faith leaders all over the state, and it just got sent to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There are over 75 faith leader signatures on this. Again, to sort of try to stave this project off before it gets any further along, even though there is not a comment period yet. There are over here also some petitions that you can sign, and these were created by the folks down in southeast New Mexico. We're working with faith leaders down there. We will be organizing people to go down to hearings when that happens, whenever that happens. So again, as Don was saying, your voice is very important, your comments, and there's a coalition of people, groups that are meeting via phone with the folks down in southeast New Mexico every week. And some of those folks are here in the room, Sister Marlene and Janet and Robin and Don are part of that. So all of that work is really important. I might just mention also, so at the end, if you want to look at any of these t-shirts, you're welcome to have those. And one of the other issues NMIPL is working on, out of concern for the southeast part of the state, is the methane pollution from oil and gas issue. I have here a petition that can be signed. We're collecting those to try to get a good BLM rule for methane. The one that we had is just recently gutted. Anyway, so we have a comment period for that as well. So please help yourself to information. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming. And you can stay and ask more questions if you like. Pass the word to friends, neighbors, everyone. And if you know people in the southeast part of the state, be in solidarity with them and contact others that you might know down there. So thank you very, very much.